Love this podcast? Support this show through the Acast supporter feature. It's up to you how much you give, and there's no regular commitment. Just hit the link in the show description to support now.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever find yourself playing the budgeting game? Well, with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive, you can find options that fit your budget and potentially lower your bills. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.
Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds. At Mint Mobile, we like to do the opposite of what Big Wireless does. They charge you a lot. We charge you a little. So naturally, when they announced they'd be raising their prices due to inflation, we decided to deflate our prices due to not hating you. That's right. We're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
What makes a great pair of glasses? At Warby Parker, it's all the invisible extras without the extra cost. Their designer quality frames start at $95, including prescription lenses, plus scratch-resistant, smudge-resistant, and anti-reflective coatings, and UV protection, and free adjustments for life. To find your next pair of glasses, sunglasses, or contact lenses, or to find the Warby Parker store nearest you, head over to warbyparker.com. That's warbyparker.com.
This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hello everybody, my name is John Bleasdale and I am a writer and film critic, and today I am going to be talking to Ben Slater, the author of Kinda Hot, The Making of St. Jack in Singapore. This book chronicles the making of Peter Bogdanovich's wonderful film starring Ben Gazzara and Denholm Elliott. It's a film that I hadn't heard about, to tell you the truth, before Ben Slater got in touch with me and told me about his book. So I watched it precisely so that I could read the book and get the most out of it. I was incredibly grateful because this is a superb film and a wonderful performance. Actually, every aspect of this film is great. It looks fantastic. The story is fascinating. Performances are all great, as I've already mentioned. It's a real treat. If you haven't seen St. Jack before, listen to the podcast and then I guarantee you will want to dig it out and watch it. Or do it the other way around. I don't care. Whichever works for me. If you enjoyed the episode, please remember to like, subscribe, do all those things on social media that will help us grow as a podcast. I truly appreciate it. And enjoy the conversation.
But yes. So how did I get to Singapore? Well, I mean, when we talk about my interest in St. Jack, and it comes out of my coming to Singapore for the first time, and so my relationship with the film and my relationship with Singapore, they run parallel to each other. So I originally came to Singapore in 1998 to do a theatre production. So I had gone to university with a Singaporean friend who was a student at Bristol Uni with me when we were doing drama. And she had come back to Singapore after graduation, and she invited me along with her, another really good friend of mine from Bristol who would become her husband. And they had started a little theatre company, and they invited me to come in 98. And they told me that the year before, in 1997, they had attended the first ever screening in Singapore of this film called St. Jack. And I knew the name, and I knew Bogdanovich. You know, I was pretty aware of Bogdanovich's career, but I had somehow never seen St. Jack, and was really only dimly aware that it was made in Singapore. I just knew there was this film that was based on a Paul Theroux novel that was set in Asia, but I knew very little about it. And now I was in Singapore, and I was getting to know this country that I think a lot of people don't know very much about Singapore, even today. And there have been things like Crazy Rich Asians, and Singapore comes up in the news in all sorts of weird contexts. Like I know it came up in the UK a lot. During Brexit as some sort of exemplar. But generally speaking, people don't really know much about Singapore. And I certainly didn't. I was completely ignorant about Singapore. So I came to Singapore in the late 90s, was heard about this film that had been made in Singapore. So I was immediately very curious about the film. And suddenly I now had this relationship with Singapore. And I fell in love with a Singaporean. All right. Is that oversharing? I don't know. So I'm falling in love with a country. I'm falling in love with a person who is now my wife, and she's, you know, in the next room. And then I'm hearing about this film, and I'm so curious about the film. And I go back to the UK after this time I spent in Singapore. It's about 2 months, and I can't see the film because it came out in England or the UK on VHS in the early 80s, but basically was out of print. And I couldn't get hold of the VHS tape, and there was no DVD at that point, and DVD was just starting to become popular then. And then all I could do was read the book. So I got hold of Paul Theroux's novel, St. Jack, and I really enjoyed it. And the book has like a very, very palpable sense of place. And I was able to connect that, even though Singapore has changed so radically. And that is part of the narrative of Singapore, that it's just moved so fast and developed so quickly that the world of St. Jack is almost like another country. There were enough pockets of old Singapore that I had bumped into that I could really connect it with the book and really enjoyed the book, as well as it being this kind of bit of the past and a bit of the history of Singapore. And then finally, I think about early 2001, that I was just looking on Amazon and I saw there was a DVD of St. Jack. And at that point, Roger Corman had started putting out some of his more sort of prestige titles on DVD in America, and I immediately ordered it. It was on NTSC, so I had to find a player for it. And for non-UK listeners, NTSC is not a format we can play in the UK. We play PAL. And luckily, I was working in a cinema in Sheffield, and we had an NTSC player. And I watched the film, and so going to Singapore in '98 was a life-changing experience in a lot of ways, but then watching the film was like a whole other life-changing experience. I mean, I'd been looking forward to seeing the film. I'd been excited about it, and I'd heard about it from my friends who'd seen it in '97. And by the way, the film was still banned in Singapore. They were only allowed to do this one screening in '97 as part of the film festival. You know, the film was more than I could have hoped for. You know, I think I probably had set my expectations to maybe it wouldn't be quite as good as I hoped it would be. But I just loved the film and was really blown away by it. I mean, it just absolutely exceeded all expectations I had. And there were a couple of things that really stood out for me. One was the sort of documentary quality to the filming, in that it captured this old Singapore that was more or less gone. But as I say, there are little corners of Singapore that you can kind of identify. And actually, quite a few of the places in the film you can still go to, and they're not that different. So there was that quality to it. And, you know, the fashion, the way people spoke was captured in this really, it felt very authentic way. And then there was the non-professional cast, you know, because basically, apart from the Brits who will hang out in the bar, and Gazzara and George Lazenby, and Bogdanovich himself, of course, it's an entirely non-professional cast. And I just found that the way that Bogdanovich was able to work with essentially amateur actors and blend them in with his professional cast, it just works so well. And that is an incredibly hard thing to do. And there was a real feeling of warmth about the film. it didn't feel patronizing at all. It didn't feel like this group of white dudes showing up and sort of making Singapore into a backdrop to their story. It felt, there is an element of that. And that can't be denied. And that is sort of baked into the novel as well as the film. But there was a real warmth and generosity to the way that Singapore is used as a location, and more than a location, actually there are characters in the film who are Singaporean or Asian who do feel like real people. They don't feel like props that were just there in the backdrop, which is often the case in other films from, say, the 60s and 70s, American and British films that are shot in Asia. Some of them shot in Singapore, where they're just waiters and maids and policemen, and they just don't really have any agency. But it really felt like these characters were really breathing and really alive. So I immediately thought, I really want to find out about this film. Like, there was a lot of questions, and I'd done a little bit of research online, and at that time Bogdanovich was quite low key, I would say, as a presence. He was kind of had done a bunch of TV movies in the 90s, but he wasn't doing a lot. The Cat's Meow had been out, I think, but he'd done a few interviews, and he talked about Saint Jack, and there's also a commentary track on the DVD, which isn't great. I can say that now. It's mostly Bogdanovich saying, "I heard they tore that building down." But I could tell, just from reading a bit here and a bit there, that there was an interesting story behind the making of the film. And, when I heard that Orson Welles was the person that identified it as material for a movie, I was immediately like, okay, there's a good story here. And that's when I decided not to write a book. My first instinct was, ridiculously, to make a documentary. It didn't even occur to me to write a book. I was just thinking, okay, I'm going to do a documentary, and we're going to go to Singapore. I'm going to go back to Singapore with a camera, and we're going to film the Singapore now, and we're going to compare it to Singapore then, and we're going to try and find the people that worked on the film and interview them, and it will be really, really interesting. And of course, none of that happened. I never got anywhere with that project. And 1 or 2 years later, I moved to Singapore. I decided to just take the leap and go to Singapore to be with Marianne. And then in the back of my mind, it was like, I've got to do something about St. Jack. I've got to do something. And I began to meet people who knew about film, and I met people that knew about St. Jack. But, I thought Singapore's a really small place. And you meet one person, they know someone, and they know someone. It's very easy to build a network in Singapore quite quickly. But I wasn't meeting anyone who knew like first-hand stories about what the filmmaking had been like. It just wasn't bumping into those people. And so it went on the back burner. And then a few years later, I kind of revived it, and I had a film blog. And this is pre-social media, really. It was when there was that period where blogging was social media. Do you remember that?
Twitter, I remember first reading about Twitter as a micro-blogging site.
Yes,
so
exactly.
So the actual definition of Twitter was micro-blogging, so tiny 120 characters.
Yes, save yourself having to craft, really complicated bits of writing, and you just have to write your thoughts out. I remember thinking, as a blogger in the sort of 2005 period, that would be great not to have to write such long posts. Anyway, I wrote 2 posts about St. Jack, which were entirely based on just stuff I'd gleaned on the internet and just putting them together. And they did get a really good response. And so I knew someone who worked for a publisher in Singapore. And I asked her, do you think anyone would be interested in this book? Because I needed a kick in the backside. I needed somebody to say, hey, we want this book. I was teaching and I was doing various other things, and I just needed somebody to say, hey, there's value in this, go ahead and do it. And that's when the idea for doing it as a book came. And then a publisher did offer me a very, very, very tiny advance and a deadline, and that is exactly what I needed. And it all actually happened really quickly. I think I started in early 2004. It was basically late 2004 into 2005, and then it was done by early 2006, and then it came out So it's actually a really old book now. Well, relatively speaking.
When I finished it, I was reading the glossaries in the back of not the glossaries, the sort of bios in the back. And it was interesting because Bogdanovich was kind of like, and that was the last thing he did. And it was like, well, I saw a film of his quite recently. And of course, he then came out and made maybe a couple of films after that. I saw a film of his at Venice, which I really liked.
Would that have been She's Funny That Way?
Yes, that will have been that. That will have been.
Well,
that.
you have to read the article, and I'll send you the link if you haven't seen it, to this guy called James Kenny, who's found the Bogdanovich's preferred cut of She's Funny That Way.
Oh, right, okay.
Which was called Squirrels to the Nuts, and there was some dispute with the producers, and it was very drastically re-edited and reshot, somewhat against Bogdanovich's wishes, but he kind of just went along with it. But there is another cut of the film that has been that has showed up weirdly enough on eBay, and this guy who's a super Bogdanovich fan called James has managed to get hold of it.
Oh wow! No, I'll look into that. Just for our listeners, because I had never heard of Saint Jack before I received your book, or I received your email first. And I was kind of like, do I want to watch a sort of lesser Bogdanovich? Am I really? And I thought, okay, I found it. I watched it before I read your book.
Oh, good.
And I was just blown away. I had as you can tell, very low expectations. I mean, I like Bogdanovich, nothing to criticize him, but just the very fact that I hadn't heard anything about this film made me think, well, there's probably a reason for that. And I really, really rated it. I just would like for the listeners, because I think probably quite a few of them haven't seen the film, if you could just give us sort of like a setup of the synopsis.
So Saint Jack is, weirdly enough, it's actually a period piece in that it was filmed in 1978, but it's set in 1972. And it's about an American expatriate who's been living in Singapore for at least 15 years, maybe more. And he has a day job where he works as a ship's chandler, which means basically he helps a Chinese businessman to sell, stuff to sailors and ships that are coming to Singapore and stopping at the port. But we don't really see very much of that because Jack has a double life. He's actually a pimp. And he makes money from taking visitors to Singapore to meet girls and boys or whatever they want. And he's kind of made this really weird life for himself he's a kind of a hustler, essentially. And in the movie, he's played by Ben Gazzara.
Who is phenomenal. That's such a good performance. I would put it up there with like Jeff Bridges in The Dude, in the Big Lebowski, which of course Gazzara's in as well. Also playing kind of, you could kind of watch this as a prequel to the Big Lebowski.
Well, the character he becomes in the Big Lebowski, that would be like the best case scenario,
right?
For Jack Flowers, that he becomes Jackie Treehorn, and becomes a successful pornographer. But yeah, no, I mean Gazzara is quite similar in a lot of his films. But this is really like maximum Gazzara. I mean, along with Killing of a Chinese Bookie and a couple of other great performances. I mean, this draws out all the best qualities of Gazzara, which is this amazing face, really, and that
wonderful voice. That I think you refer to it in the book as that sort of typical drawl.
Yes, and I one of the people that worked on the film said that when he was shooting, they couldn't understand what he was saying because he spoke so low and so deep that it was barely audible, but it was like beautifully picked up on the mics. And he's got this amazing voice, and he just feels like somebody who's really lived a life and seen a lot. And Gazzara was definitely a very troubled guy, and so he's able to express all of this insecurity and this sort of fear that the Jack character has in his eyes, even while he puts on this appearance of being completely on top of things. So Jack, the trajectory of Jack is that he wants to start his own brothel, and he has this dream of almost a Playboy Mansion-like place, this kind of beautiful old mansion with live music and a bar and beautiful women floating around. And he briefly achieves that dream, but unfortunately he runs foul of local gangsters. And then in the sort of final act of the film, he has one last chance to sort of make a buck which is when he is, well, firstly, he gets offered the opportunity to run an R&R camp for GIs who are on their break from fighting in the Vietnam War. And that was a very important subplot for Bogdanovich because he really saw this as his anti-war statement. And then when that falls apart, as it eventually does, he gets another chance to become a blackmailer, basically. And that kind of sets up the final confrontation of the film, which I don't want to spoil for people. So it's really a film about a man who's extremely amoral in many ways, finding his morality or finding the edges of his morality. And that is definitely an element of Theroux's novel, but that gets brought out even more in Bogdanovich's version.
It's weird because you're watching this movie and I'm thinking, I can see where a bad movie would go here. I can see a sort of one of the things that really elevates the film is the friendship between Gazzara's character Jack Flowers and William Lee, the character played by Denholm Elliott, and sort of English, similar sort of an expat who's living in Hong Kong but who comes in temporarily to do some accountancy work for the company that Jack works for, and he's got to sort of taxi him around, and they sort of become friends. And there's a small moment that I wanted to just underline because I think I treasure these moments in films as a writer, as somebody who's also attempted to write screenplays of varying degrees of success.
Me too.
There's a bit where in the taxi, Jack refers to William as Willie or Billy or something, he abbreviates his name. And
I think he calls him Bill, yeah.
Bill, yeah. And he says, yeah, Bill, because it's not even that sort of like over friendly or anything like that. William says, no, William. And that's it. For the rest of the film, he calls him William, and he's corrected, and I just thought that's so good because, you're setting up this quite stuffy English character with this very laid-back American character, and a lesser screenwriter, a lesser novelist, a lesser film would have maintained that sort of friction for a little bit longer, maybe until something happened, and then as a sign of respect, I'll call you Will. But Gazzara is just like, he's partly because of that's his role. He's there to make people comfortable. So you want to be called William? That's important to people. I'm going to call you William. Yeah. And it's just such it's wonderful. But I love that whole relationship with Denholm Elliott and Gazzara. And again, perhaps a career best performance from Denholm Elliott in this as well.
Yeah, it's a wonderful performance from Elliott. The interesting thing about that friendship is that isn't really in the book. That is something that developed as they were working on the script. And especially once they got to Singapore as well, because there was a lot of improvisation, a lot of last-minute rewriting. But the book was rather problematic to adapt because essentially it begins with William Lee arriving in Singapore and then, spoiler alert, dying, and then it goes into a series of flashbacks to Jack Flowers' past, and then it sort of catches up at the present. And that was a real problem for them to kind of make that into a satisfying film, not to mention the fact they'd have to sort of age characters and de-age characters at various points, which was not something that was easy to do at that point. And so the idea of basically breaking up William Lee's visits so he comes 3 times instead of 1 was a brilliant idea, because it essentially gives their 3 sections to the film that are all sort of marked around those visits. But in order for that to work, the relationship had to change between the characters. And in Theroux's book, William Lee is a kind of shadow figure for Jack, who really he embarrasses him. He's this person that Jack sees himself in and yet is sort of cringing at the way he behaves. And then, of course, when he dies, he's really feeling his own mortality. Whereas in the movie, they do make it into a much more of essentially a kind of buddy relationship. As you say, it's this kind of these unlikely friends, and yet it creates a whole level of warmth which isn't in the book. And the interplay between the two of them is really beautiful. But that point that you made earlier about how the film, you can see the way the film could go perhaps in a more cliched direction, and then it steers away from it. I mean, that really was Bogdanovich's mode. Like, he could see the beats that would be the obvious beats, and he really always tried to go left instead of right. For instance, the the obvious scene is the scene where the young boy beats up the prostitute. And there is that, and for me, this is one of the most powerful scenes in the film, which is where Jack just walks into the bedroom and sees him with his friends afterwards, after they've made sure the girl is okay, and he just looks at him, and that's it. And in the book, I think he does slap him around a little bit. I mean, it's not really a scene, but it's just mentioned. But Bogdanovich just didn't want that kind of moment. And similarly, he doesn't ever get revenge on the gangsters that sort of beat him up. So it never goes to those really obvious places. So it does become, and the friendship as well, it feeds into this, that it sort of goes against some typical idea about masculinity and being a hero.
And also cross-cultural things of sort of Englishness and Americanness, and the loud American against the sort of, well, all the English are the loud Americans, the loud, ugly Americans are the English guys in the bar, not Jack.
Yes. I mean, that a lot of that comes from Paul Theroux's experience teaching at the university in Singapore, and in some ways the St. Jack book is a thinly veiled metaphor, if you will, for Paul Theroux being this sort of young American showing up at this very stuffy English expat environment and being made to feel like a second-class citizen. But Bogdanovich had none of that baggage, so he does something very different with it. And he makes William Lee into this much more sympathetic character. But while they still keep the guys in the bar being a kind of awful chorus of racism and misogyny and generally examples of what you shouldn't be, but they're also comic characters as well.
I kind of wouldn't mind having a drink
Rodney
with them.
Buse.
Yes, exactly. Rodney Buse from The Likely Lads shows up. That's an unlikely lad if I've ever seen one.
And I mean, this is probably more trivia than anyone wants to know, but when I was researching my book, I tried to interview Rodney Buse, and I found his agent's contact somewhere, and I wrote to them, and he said, I'm sorry, Rodney's not available. He's writing his own memoir, and he will be covering St. Jack in his memoir. And I think about 2 years later, I found the memoir, and I was like, okay, maybe there's some really great details that I didn't include in my book, and it was barely mentioned. It was like there was just one passing reference to him being drunk the whole time, not remembering much, and not liking Peter Bogdanovich, and that was basically it. So Rodney Buse did not have great stories about his time in Singapore.
Yeah, apparently you said Joss Ackland of that bunch didn't get on with anybody.
Yes, yeah, because Joss Ackland's character in the book is the leader. He's the one that's sort of in charge of that group and the most cutting one. And you do see, well, he basically doesn't show up again. He's in the first big scene in the bar, but then he disappears, and that is apparently because he just didn't really want to come back, and he somehow managed to get out of his contract. So James Villiers, who's brilliant, ends up taking on a lot of his role and his lines, and I think they rewrote a lot of them themselves. Although, to be fair to Theroux, quite a lot of it comes from him.
Right, I see. I mean, also you mentioned in the book there was a quotation, I think, coming via Bogdanovich from Howard Hawks, where he talks about how audiences always expect certain scenes, and they're really happy when you don't give them those scenes.
Yes,
and I think that's referring to the scene in the brothel in the R&R center when the young boy sort of beats up the prostitute. That's doing that. That's giving you. That's not giving you the scene that you go, okay, now we've got to see this confrontation, and it's like, no, there's no confrontation.
Yeah, there were Bogdanovich is making this film in a total state of creative freedom. Roger Corman had financed it and given him at least $1 million, maybe a bit more. Opinions vary on how much was put into it. And he was in Singapore. He had almost no one checking in on him. I mean, he was able to do whatever he wanted creatively. Gazzara deserves a lot of credit. I think he did a lot of work rewriting the script too. And they could just, I mean, within the practicalities of filming a relatively low budget film, entirely on location, which was really hard. I mean, it was damn hard work, but nobody was stopping him doing whatever he wanted with the story.
1 million in Singapore would still, I mean, you're still filming. I mean, they had to get all the equipment flown in with Lufthansa. Yeah. I mean, it's not maybe the cheapness of, I'm not even sure, would Singapore have been particularly cheap?
I think Singapore it was more expensive than some of the other options, particularly the Philippines, which is where Roger Corman wanted them to film. There, the money would have gone a lot further, but Bogdanovich really insisted on shooting in Singapore because of the book being set in Singapore, and he realized that Singapore had very unique characteristics in terms of the sort of multiracial mix of it, and the landscape and the geography of it that he wanted to capture. So yeah, the money was spent quickly, but they could do quite a bit with it. But they were working within certain parameters. For instance, they tried to shoot everything in private locations, like hotels and people's houses. They really tried to avoid anything that would involve bringing them up with getting permission from the Singapore government, which is a whole other dimension of the film that we've not talked about, which is that essentially they were making it in secret. which was another aspect of when I was thinking about writing the book. I was like, this is wild. I mean, there are very, very few movies made at this level with, famous actors, famous directors, where they made the film in secret.
It's like a Peter Sellers film, isn't it?
Yeah, After the Fox.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that aspect of it was like, how did they do it? Like it was like as I say, I was filled with questions like, how do you pull that off? How do you make a film of that scale without people finding out?
So, how much input did you have from Bogdanovich and the other sort of creative forces that went into making the film?
I mean, I didn't want to write the book unless Peter Bogdanovich A, approved of it, and B, was willing to talk to me about it. It wouldn't have worked if I hadn't got his take on it, and so I had a contact who had interviewed him for another book. It was actually Tom Charity. I don't know whether you know Tom Charity, who used to write for Time Out. He wrote a book about John Cassavetes, and he had interviewed Peter for that. So Tom very generously gave me Peter's contact, or a contact for one of his assistants, and so I wrote to him, and I was amazed that I got a response. And it took a while, but not that long. I was listening to your interview with Jonathan Melville, where some of his interviews take years to come off. I think it took me a month or two, but finally I did get Peter on the phone, and that was an amazing call, and we spoke for about 2 hours, and I interviewed him about 3 times, I think, and each time was about 2 hours. And what I did was I didn't interview him all in one big chunk. I spaced it out so that I was able to come back to him after I'd done more research and spoken to more people. And when I first interviewed him, even though people hadn't asked him a lot about St. Jack, they'd asked him enough that he had certain set anecdotes. And if you hear any interviews with Peter, there are certain routines he will go into. Certain stories that he will repeat. And so he'd repeated a fair few of the St. Jack stories, and I needed to try and get beyond that. So I did manage to do that. Each time I interviewed him, I sort of hit him with new things that I'd learned, and then he could then respond to it. And he was actually really good about it, because sometimes I'm hitting him with things that weren't necessarily very positive. For instance, I realized there was this conflict on set between him and the French producer who'd been hired by Corman to oversee the production, a guy called Pierre Cottrell. And Cottrell only had negative things to say about Peter. He absolutely hated. And now both of them have passed away. I can talk about it a bit more freely. And I had to temper that to some extent. But I was able to go to Peter and say, I've interviewed Pierre now. And I remember the first time I told Peter that I'd interviewed Pierre, and I could feel him sort of, even on the phone, I could feel him sort of becoming quite uncomfortable.
The temperature in the room went very cold.
Yes, I'm trying to find the right metaphor. Yeah, something about the air in the room changed, and he was like, "Oh, you've talked to Pierre, have you? And then it was like, okay, and now we got onto this other topic, which was the fights they were having, and then this, in a way, the book has a little bit of a climax, which is where there's a little bit of a chase to see who can get the film, who can seize the film, with Pierre versus Peter, which is kind of a fun thing that I found out about, and I was able to ask Peter what happened and get his version of the events. So yes, I had access to Peter. Ben Gazzara I was able to speak to, and Ben Gazzara was at that point living in, he would spend a lot of the year in Italy, and he was writing his own biography, his autobiography at that time. And then I think he actually started writing a novel. I have a feeling that when I spoke to him, he was writing a novel which has never been published. But somewhere there is a Ben Gazzara novel out there. And maybe unfinished. But I had about a 20-minute call with him, and that was really magical. as I think I say in the book, I mean, it feels like you're actually talking to the character from the film, because the way he speaks, it's very poetic, it's very funny, and he really is that guy. So when you speak to Ben Gazzara, you're just on a high after that.
Yeah, he's got a sort of legendary aspect to him.
But you mentioned his voice. Sadly, by the time I spoke to him, his voice had really gone because he'd had cancer, and he'd if you watch the later performance.
It took a lifetime to find the person you want to marry. Finding the perfect engagement ring is a lot easier. At BlueNile.com, you can find or design the ring you've always dreamed of, with help from Blue Nile's jewelry experts, who are on hand 24/7 to answer questions, and the ease and convenience of shopping online. For a limited time, get $50 off your purchase of $500 or more with code LISTEN at BlueNile.com. That's $50 off with code LISTEN at BlueNile.com.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever find yourself playing the budgeting game? Well, with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive, you can find options that fit your budget and potentially lower your bills. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.
In the last few films he did, the voice is really, there's very little of it left, unfortunately.
Yeah, those constant cigarettes in the end.
Cigars.
Cigars as well, yes, absolutely, yeah. Yeah, my God, he smokes all the way through the film as well, doesn't he? And in fact, the cigar is like almost becomes like a metaphor that he's constantly exchanging cigars with the CIA guy.
Yeah, him and Peter Bogdanovich plays this character, the Eddie Schumann, the sort of CIA spook character, and there's a lot of cigar smoking there. There is, even though the film questions certain elements of masculinity, there is also another very macho element to it, of these two guys smoking cigars and sharing the same women and having a wild old time in Asia. And there definitely is that element to it as well, it makes it a little bit more uncomfortable now. But I think the good elements of it sort of outweigh that. But I've seen the film so many times. There are some bits of it that make me slightly cringe after all of these years, especially knowing what they were up to behind the scenes. There was a lot of seeing prostitutes going on, at the back. And of course they were casting a movie, so they had access to lots of young women. So that was clearly a big preoccupation for both of them, and they really bonded over that. And you can sort of see a little bit of that on screen as well.
They're even joking about it in terms of Gazzara telling his daughter that we were writing and thinking last night, or we're doing deep research. Yes. And it's just like, guys, that doesn't play well. It doesn't read the room.
There's did you hear the TCM, the Turner Classic Movies podcast about Bogdanovich's life, which he did? No. Luckily they got it done before he passed away.
Right.
I actually contributed to the episode that deals with St. Jack, and they do actually, Ben Mankiewicz, of course, relative of Mank, who you've mentioned on previous podcasts. He does call Peter out on his sort of macho and misogynistic behavior a couple of times. And actually, it's a pretty good moment if you listen to that episode. He does talk to Peter about the sort of dynamics of him, basically sort of acquiring the women who he was casting in the film.
But I mean, that feels like it's also what the film is about to some degree. It is about. It's not like this is something that is unexamined. Maybe it could be done a bit more critically. But on the other hand, one of the things that I really liked about the movie, and I can't claim originality for this because I looked at a Letterboxd review. And somebody was saying how they really, really loved Gazzara's character, Jack, because he was sex positive. And I thought, you don't often think of that, there's again, in a bad version of this movie, him being a pimp would just be an automatically negative thing, would just be automatically, he's exploiting these women, this is terrible, this is horrible. But there's an element that he's just like, yeah, everyone's having sex and that's what everyone's here for, and why not? Why is it? Yeah, I mean, he's basically, he's a sex worker. He's middle management as a sex worker, you know? And there are definite issues with that. Yeah. There's definite issues with that. There's definite problems with that. But also, let's not just immediately sort of knee-jerk react from a sort of Victorian mindset.
The way that Jack doesn't judge anybody about their sexuality at all, and again doesn't patronize. There's no kind of like, you know, when he's interacting with the trans characters, there's no sense that he looks down on them at all. And that non-judgmental quality to it does make the film kind of ahead of its time for an American film. It is actually quite unusual to see a character who isn't casting any judgment at all.
When he goes to the hotel with William, and he says to the sort of the bellboy or whoever's
the
brought
bellboy,
them up, yeah, and he sort of says, "Wipe that smirk off your face. I know what you're thinking." And but it's not like. It's not like a hang up of a like he thought we were gay and, you know, gets angry about it or
no, like he doesn't care at all.
Yeah, exactly. It's just like he thinks it's funny, you know. So yeah, fair enough. That could be what we're doing, but we're not doing it.
Yeah, no, and that scene, I love that scene, by the way, where he you know, where Denham Elliott lies down on the bed and he brings him the water and he sort of makes sure the air conditioning on. It is so tender. It is almost romantic in its tenderness, and it is actually quite a rare depiction of male friendship. But then after he leaves the hotel room, one of my favorite shots in the film is a tracking shot of Ben Gazzara walking down a corridor in Raffles Hotel, and you can sort of see a bit of the what's happening outside the window. It's almost in silhouette, and it's such a beautiful shot, but it also has this real quality of him thinking about death, basically, and him knowing that this guy that he's just left behind is not got long for the world, and thinking about his own death. And it's really powerful. And there are a number of shots like that. I mean, we should talk about Robbie Muller, the cinematographer.
I was exactly. There's a good point. I was to ask about that. Go ahead.
I actually forgotten quite how Robbie got involved in the film. It's in my book. I do remember there's a story that American Friend, Wim Wenders' American Friend, was playing in America, and so Bogdanovich rings up Sybil Shepherd and says, "Can you go and see American Friend and tell me what it looks like?" And she says, "I couldn't make head nor tail of the film, but it looks great." And so they hired Robbie on the back of that recommendation. I think Pierre Cottrell had actually pushed for Robbie because other French cinematographers weren't available. And then they hired Robbie, and not just Robbie, but his entire team, his whole camera crew that he had by that point been working with for a while on the Wim Wenders films. And they were all flown out to Singapore. So there was this Dutch film crew. I mean, you know, for people that don't know St. Jack, it is an extraordinary collection of people that end up working on this film. You've got Robbie Muller and the Dutch camera team who've all been working on Wim Wenders films and other great films for the last decade, at least by that point. You've got Jean-Pierre Roux, who's a sort of sound man who'd worked a lot with Polanski. He later worked with Sergio Leone. He worked with Eric Romer, which is how Pierre Cottrell knew him. And he was a real innovator in terms of using radio mics on set, which he did on St. Jack. You've got the makeup artist from Star Wars, Graham Freeborn, and his son, who are doing the very hardly seen tattoo makeup on Ben Gazzara. You've got a French assistant director. You've got Lisa Liu, who is a legendary Chinese actress who'd gone to America to be in American films, gone back to Hong Kong and had been in Shaw Brothers films, playing the Empress Dowager, a role she reprised in Bertolucci's The Last Emperor. She is in the film and had been hired to work on the film by Roger Corman because they felt like it was good to have someone who spoke Chinese, on the producing side. And of course, you've got Bogdanovich and you've got Gazzara and you've got George Lazenby. James Bond himself pops up playing a gay senator,
and he's excellent in it as well. I mean, he gets a lot of stick for on Her Majesty's Secret Service, but which I love,
by the way.
Exactly, yeah. I was just about to say it's a really good performance, I think. But in this film, he's super.
Well, you were talking about that non-judgmental quality. The scene where Jack bribes the hustler, the gay prostitute, to go up to his room or to let Jack see what's going on in the room. That is another beautiful little moment where, the way that Jack treats that guy, who is also not a professional actor and is obviously from that world. They cast him because he was from that world. And it's just done, it doesn't feel like he's threatening him. It doesn't feel like he's bullying him. It doesn't feel like he's homophobic. But yes, George Lazenby agreed to do it because he was in Singapore shooting an episode of Hawaii Five-0. And they just said to him, like, we need a guy to play this role. And I think they hadn't cast it. I'm not quite sure why they hadn't cast it. That was the way it worked with a lot of roles. Bogdanovich also cast himself last minute to play the CIA guy. That was meant to be Charles Grodin at one point, but I don't think they ever did anything much about it. So there was a very improvised quality to it, and because they knew Lazenby was there, he agreed to be in the film, and it was kind of amazing that he would do that role because it's so against type for him.
And it works because of that, because it's sort of like, this sort of exterior sort of as American masculinity, and then he's getting boys to come up to the hotel room.
Yes, exactly. Yes, which is different. That's a big difference from the book. In the book, it's kind of a different situation. It's with a girl that he brings back. But in the book, one of the issues in the book is they feel like they haven't got enough material to blackmail the character. So Jack is really hoping that he'll show them the pictures, but it won't really play, so he can be let off the hook. But Bogdanovich had a different view. He wanted it to be really shocking what was happening in the hotel. And actually, they took a couple of days off shooting to sit in the hotel to try and figure out the whole sequence and to figure out what was going to be happening in that hotel room, and that's what they ended up with.
In terms of the way they use, we talked about it a little bit earlier, but that this could easily be a sort of sexploitation movie. And in fact, like Corman, according to your book, he's quoted in your book as saying, this was a film about sex in Singapore and it didn't have anywhere near enough nudity. I mean, it's quite restrained. It's quite restrained in that.
Roger Corman, it's fair to say, was very disappointed with the lack of what he would probably call marketable elements. He I think he even said to me in the interview that he would have liked them to have gone back and shot some more nudity and sex, but it was just not an option because they basically had to run out of town before they got caught by the authorities. So yes, it was a big disappointment for him. Yeah, the
relationship of Bogdanovich with the crew and with everybody, it kind of gets quite bumpy. What was your sense of that? Because there's a lot of sort of he said she said about that element of the production.
I think I got to know Peter a little bit by talking to him on the phone, but the Peter I was meeting was a Peter who'd been truly humbled by life, and obviously in particular losing the woman the love of his life, Dorothy Stratton, to a terrible murder, and then losing all of his money and losing his career and losing a lot of his status. So I was talking to a Peter who was very affable Peter Bogdanovich. But the Peter Bogdanovich of 1978 was really, even though he'd had his box office flops, he was still pretty much on top of the world. And I think Peter was somebody that some people really got on with and really had a good time with, and other people just didn't like him and just took very strongly against him. And I think the crew was sort of divided in that regard. And I think that a lot of the Europeans didn't warm to him greatly. They found him pretty arrogant. Robbie Muller told me that he found Bogdanovich somebody that you had to kind of manage, basically. You handled him with care. And there is some great footage that was shot by the BBC of them filming, and you actually get to see the relationship between Robbie and Peter. And Robbie is, it's well known that on sets, Robbie was beloved by the crew and often the cast. Seeing them work together is really interesting because they obviously found a way to work. And you can see Peter being slightly deferential to Robbie, which was, not what you necessarily expect. And so I think, Peter was to some extent could be divisive. I mean, Cottrell really disliked him and just found him so arrogant, and found, ironically, Cottrell, the sort of French cosmopolitan who'd come up through the new wave, he found Peter's behavior kind of abhorrent. He found all of the seeing all the prostitutes and all of that stuff somewhat disgusting. And he really kind of stressed that to me, that he thought Peter's behavior was pretty shocking and exploitative. So there was that element too playing into it. But yeah, I think people had different opinions about Peter, and I don't think I didn't get a sense of like him being just dreadful. He was definitely arrogant. There's no doubt about it. And I think if you got on the wrong side of him, he wouldn't be an easy person to deal with. He expected a very high level from everybody around him.
Yeah,
but I also think there were people that loved him and really got on well with him, and you can see that through his career and the later parts of his career. I mean, when he passed away, there was such an outpouring of grief, and people who worked with him writing these really beautiful accounts of projects that they'd done with him and how sweet he was. But that was all a kind of post-80s Peter, really, that they were talking about. But even people that work with him on Last Picture Show, there's a real fondness there for Peter. He's kind of still for me a very enigmatic person, and a very unique character and very unique personality.
It's weird because other than seeing Last Picture Show, my second first meeting with him would have been as the author of This Is Orson Welles, and yes, reading that, and so also sort of seeing him very much as an acolyte and as a researcher and as somebody who was building up sort of golden age Hollywood. It's almost like he's an extension of the Cahiers people, how Truffaut found.
Well, he was definitely an auteurist.
Exactly.
Him and Andrew Sarris were heavily into the auteur thing to some degree. Yeah.
So him going around and interviewing John Ford and Frank Capra and all these people.
Hitchcock.
Yeah. So, I mean, the film comes out, and it's interesting as well that it isn't a flop by any means. It's actually kind of quite successful, right?
Well, I think it didn't really make any money in America, and it got critical acclaim in Europe, and it won the Critics' Award at Venice. And Denham Elliott was nominated for a BAFTA in the UK. Although I did a little bit of research, and it seemed it was released almost entirely only in London, in Soho, in some sort of sleazy cinema in Soho. It did not have a wide release in the UK. And the American reception was mixed. Roger Ebert really liked it, but Vincent Canby in the New York Times didn't like it, which was really, for Peter, the New York Times was really the one. You've got to get a great review from the New York Times. So he was still upset about that review. All of those years later, when I spoke to him,
he says Canby slept through the screening.
He'd heard a rumor that Canby had fallen asleep. Yeah, so that I mean, Peter took that to heart, and also he felt that Roger didn't do a good job with the release. That Roger tried to release it like a B movie, and it needed a bigger platform. The story is that Peter wanted to sell the film to a studio,
right,
and get it away from Roger. And was hoping he was hoping that once people saw the edited version, that he could sell it and actually have a proper release for it. But that never happened. The studios didn't buy. I don't know whether the offers ever came or whether there weren't enough money. I'm not quite sure what happened. I mean, I know that Peter and Roger remained on good terms in the end, but there was a wobbly moment there where they weren't very happy with each other in the aftermath of St. Jack. And I think Roger told me that it did eventually break even, but it took a long time. It was one of the few films that Roger Corman had put money into that he didn't make money back, within a certain period of time. And he did have to wait a long time before it eventually broke even. So it wasn't a flop. It wasn't a disaster. It wasn't a flop in the way that the earlier films that Peter Bogdanovich had made, At Long Last Love and Daisy Miller and Nickelodeon, they were considered flops because they were big budget films made by studios. Whereas this was an independent film, basically, made on a very low budget with very low expectations. It was just that Peter was seen as this big time Hollywood director. And for him, he wanted both critical acclaim and financial success, which he had seen with Last Picture Show and What's Up, Doc and Paper Moon. They had all hit all the buttons, So that's what he expected, and it didn't happen, and it was a big disappointment. But he then used the energy of this guerrilla approach to filmmaking to go into They All Laughed, which was going to be the next project that was really going to put him on the map. And in a way, he saw St. Jack as kind of like a test run for like, I'm going to get back into location filming. I'm going to get back to people being on the streets. We're going to run and gun. We're not going to get permission. We're just going to improvise. And that's what They All Laughed was. So in a way, weirdly enough, it's sort of St. Jack Part 2. And Robbie Mueller was brought to New York to shoot it. So there was that continuity as well. And Ben, of course, Ben Gazzara was going to star again. So they wanted to kind of reproduce the magic of St. Jack. And of course, that didn't happen. And partly that was because of what happened with Dorothy Stratton.
I just have to absolutely underline that if you're listening to this and you haven't seen St. Jack, you really got to watch it. It's a real...
And I presume you saw it online.
Yeah.
Yes. So somebody, I don't know, about 4 years ago, somebody did put the whole film on YouTube. And I'm amazed that it's still up there. I really am. But if you want to see it in fantastic quality versions of it, there's an American Blu-ray available. From a company called Scorpion, which I think might be out of print, but you can probably get copies on eBay. And I did a commentary track for that, and a couple of little documentaries. I made a couple of little documentaries, or produced a couple of little documentaries. One is an interview with cast and crew that we gathered for a screening we did in 2009. That was an anniversary screening. It was the 30th anniversary screening. We did it in Singapore. And I did get quite a number of cast and crew back, so we've got that on the Blu-ray, and also a short piece about looking at Singapore now and Singapore then, and comparing the locations. So if you can get the Blu-ray, please do.
So in the end, you did do your documentary that you had originally intended.
I did. I mean, not as originally intended, but yes, documentaries were made, and I'm hoping there may be something more we can do with that material, and there may be some other kind of St. Jack project coming out of it. But one thing I definitely want to do is do a new version of the book.
Right.
Because, as you say, when you read the bits at the back about what happened to everyone next, it's pretty out of date. And I did do, when people buy the book, and I know about it because they buy it from me, I do send them a PDF, which is my afterword. But even my afterword now is so out of date. My afterword was written, 4 or 5 years ago. So that's now seriously out of date. And with Peter passing, I feel like I've really got to go back to the stuff and do a new edition. And there is a little bit more research to be done. I mean, there are documents and things I haven't seen. There's a couple of people I haven't spoken to. And I also want to write more about the film itself, because my book is very much a making of. And it's sort of, it doesn't really talk much about the actual film, in so much as to set you up so you know the context of what's going on and why it's relevant. But I really would like to write more of an appreciation of the film, because I think it is a beautiful film and still an underrated film. But it's great to see in the last 4 or 5 years, it has started to gather even more interest around it. And, if it was a cult movie when I wrote my book, it's much more so now. And I, even yesterday, online, I was seeing people quoting to each other about it, because since Peter died, there's a package of his films that's traveling around America for, basically tributes to Peter. So they're showing Last Picture Show, Targets, I think, What's Up Doc, and St. Jack is part of that package. So again, more people are seeing the film, and more people are kind of saying, "Hey, I love this film, and it's my favorite film." And I'm like, yes, great. Please read my book.
No, I mean, I think it really, really deserves to be rediscovered. I'm very happy to promote it on that basis, because it's just such a, as I say, if you hadn't sent me that book, I would not have, I don't know when I would have come across this. And the other thing is, it sort of spikes out into other sort of underseen and underappreciated films. I mean, on the back of this, I started watching, I watched Husbands, which I'd never seen before, John Cassavetes. And then that just got me into, now I've watched Opening Night, which in a way has a similar sort of, not production history, but reception history, if you like. It sort of doesn't even come out properly, and it's it's all over the place in terms of like, I think a DVD comes out in the middle of the 90s and is quickly sort of disappears, and so
Right.
there are these filmmakers who are they did really good work, and it deserves to be out there and to be seen and watched.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's always more things to discover, right? I mean, there's always gems in people's filmographies that you can't believe you overlooked. And there's always films made by people you've never heard of that are amazing and incredible. And that's one of the sort of the gifts that keeps giving of cinephilia, that there's always more to find and always more to see.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also something that makes you reappraise someone's work. I watch this and I think, that this shows me an element of Bogdanovich's sort of career that I didn't appreciate before. So I'm kind of tempted now to go back and watch some of his other films through a Saint Jack lens, if you like. Yeah,
interesting. One thing you might notice is that he has a thing about shenanigans in hotels.
Right.
It's a recurring motif that I've noticed in his films. There's often stuff involving people in the wrong hotel room or going into hotel rooms they shouldn't. There's a whole extended bit in Paper Moon about that. There's a whole thing in She's Funny That Way about hotel rooms.
Yes,
and She's Funny That Way was inspired by what happened in Singapore, where he gave money to prostitutes and told them to quit the business. So that was the germ of the idea that went into what became his last film, was from St. Jack. But yeah, there's a whole bit about hotel rooms, and then in St. Jack there's the whole hotel business at the end of the film. So I remember when I was rewatching Paper Moon when I was researching St. Jack, I was like, oh my god, he's back to people in hotel rooms and keys, and this was obviously a weird obsession that he had.
It's probably just reflecting his life as sort of an itinerant sort of, traveller.
Yes, maybe. Well, there are... St. Jack has a lot of hotels in it.
I need to ask you for a recommended book, as I ask all my guests. So what film book would you like to recommend our listeners?
Well, am I able to recommend a publication that's sort of halfway between a book and a magazine?
You may. Depends entirely on which one it is, I guess.
Well, I'm holding up now for you to see. Obviously, the listeners can't see, but so this is an edition of a kind of book magazine journal, which is called Nang, Nang, which is the Thai word for skin, which is sometimes used as the Thai word for screen, for cinema, and it's a word that pops up in other Southeast Asian countries as well. And it's a publication. It's a 10 edition or 10 issue publication that was created by a friend of mine whose name is Davide Casaro, and he had this idea of creating these 10 magazines about Asian cinema, and each one is edited by a different person, or sometimes it's two people who have an interest in Asian cinema, and each one is themed around the editor's interests, and they're very, very beautifully produced. They're made with extremely kind of high qualities of design and photo reproduction and paper, and they are books basically. I mean, they're book length. And I had the great privilege of editing the very first issue of Nung, which is about screenwriting in Asia. I was really, really happy to do it. It was an amazing opportunity to edit and, to find all of these screenwriters and get people to interview screenwriters in an area that was really underserved. I mean, no one has really done a single volume about that before. And each issue is completely different. Some are a bit more academic, some are totally accessible, some have lots of interviews. There's one that's just commissioned short stories reflecting on Asian cinema. There's one more to come, which will be issue 10, and then Davide will kind of wrap up the project. And he's now currently moved on to working for Mubi, because Mubi are now doing a print-only publication which is going to be their new version of their notebook, and Davide is working on that. So it's sort of his work with Nung has led him into now working for Mubi. In the end, we all end up working for big streaming companies. It's unavoidable, one way or the other. But Nung is still available. You can go to nungmagazine.com and you can get all of the issues apart from the one I edited. I'm very proud and somewhat smug to announce it's the only one that's completely sold out. And but the other 8 that are available, you can order online. And you can go in and look at the contents, and there's tons of stuff in there. They're really, really good. And they're real labours of love, and they are content that you can't read online. So that's another aspect that makes them really special. So that, if that's okay...
No, that's fine. That's brilliant. That sounds like a really interesting thing. I was interesting by this idea of people doing only paper printing now. It's like, publishing is entering its vinyl stage, where we're going to withdraw from the internet, and we're going to say, look, if you want to read this, you're going to have to buy a book, or you're going to have to buy the magazine, because it's not going to be, David Simon, the creator of The Wire, was very interesting it was very, very, very sort of critical and disparaging of the whole publishing industry, saying, in what business do you give away your entire product for free, in terms of newspapers and magazines? Why did you just dump everything online as at the minute that the internet came around?
Okay, so his point is that it's over now because they gave it all away for free, right?
Yeah, I mean, he was talking in the, when will it have been? It would be the early noughts, I guess, and so he was, it was kind of right when that was happening. And to tell you the truth, nowadays it's kind of difficult to read newspapers online for free. I mean, other than The Guardian.
Yeah. I pay for the New York Times for my sins.
Right, yeah, exactly. Most stuff is behind paywalls now. So I guess they listen to David Simon.
But the print only thing, I mean, that's been going on for a while. There is this whole kind of subculture of print only magazines and there is a kind of hipster element to that, as you say, a kind of like going back to vinyl or VHS tape. There's definitely a feeling of let's reject the idea that everything is accessible instantly, and I think that I agree with some of that for sure. Sometimes the magazines can be just purely beautiful objects and have very little content in them, which is, there's a market for that. But Davida's Nang project is really very content rich. But we also we have done some online stuff as well. So I actually edited an online special edition a couple of years ago. So we're not totally rejecting the internet. And of course, the internet is how you get the thing. So all of these things work well together. But I think with Mubi's Notebook, they want to do something. They've had the Notebook website for years, which used to be, I don't know whether you remember, it used to be called The Auteurs at one point.
Yeah, I remember.
Before they rebranded, although that seems like 100 years ago. But they've been putting content on that website forever, but now they want to create something more exclusive that's initially was for their subscribers, but I think it is going to be sold in shops. And yes, they want to create something that's kind of special and collectible. And that definitely speaks to a desire that people have for things that aren't just free and easily available.
Oh, brilliant. Well, listen, Ben, thanks so much for... thank you for introducing me to St. Jack. And thanks for
My pleasure, man.
And it was a really, really good book, a really interesting read. And not only in terms of the making of the film, but like, as you were saying right at the very beginning of the conversation, I'm totally ignorant about Singapore. And so reading about the history of Singapore and how it relates to the film as well, all of that stuff was super.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I know, I really appreciate it. And I've been really enjoying the podcasts.
Okay, so that was my conversation with Ben. I hope you enjoyed it. Please remember, if you want, you can follow me on Twitter at Dr. Jonty, DRJONTY. I passed 10,000 followers, and I shouldn't be pleased about this sort of thing, but I guess I am. It's very rainy here in Italy this morning. That's when I'm recording this, and so I think I might go and rewatch Saint Jack because I want to live in those beautiful tropical climes once more. Thanks go to Elliot Atkins for the music, Ali Howard for the artwork, and thank you for listening. Until next week.
If there's one thing that my family and friends know me for, it's being an amazing gift giver. I owe it all to Celebrations Passport from 1-800-Flowers.com, my one-stop shopping site that has amazing gifts for every occasion. With Celebrations Passport, I get free shipping on thousands of amazing gifts. And the more gifts I give, the more perks and rewards I earn. To learn more and take your gift giving to the next level, visit 1-800-Flowers.com/ACAST. That's 1-800-Flowers.com/ACAST.
Cue the fireplace and your favorite fall movie. There's nothing better than a cozy evening at home with a glass of First Leaf wine. First Leaf is a personalized wine club that delivers right to your door. Sounds magical, right? They get to know your favorite tasting notes, which varietals you enjoy, and whether you prefer sweet or dry wines. So in every shipment, you get bottles tailored to your unique palate. Go to tryfirstleaf.com/fall to get your first 6 wines for just $44.95 with free shipping.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be.